Welcome to the Deep Dive. You've handed us a phenomenal stack of sources this week, a real exploration of organizational cognition, and it's all anchored by this huge 2025 study from Crilly.
Yeah, that one was something else. It mapped, what, 78 different ways of thinking?
78, I mean, that number alone tells you everything about the confusion that's out there right now in corporate strategy.
Exactly. Everyone wants to adopt the next big thinking trend.
And our mission today is really to cut through that noise. We want to figure out, practically how an organization gets beyond the buzzwords to build a truly a balanced portfolio of these cognitive capabilities,
One that actually delivers.
the one that actually delivers results in these complex, volatile environments we're all in.
And that clarity is so needed. I mean, the World Economic Forum just recently highlighted systems thinking, creative thinking, analytical thinking, all as critical workplace competencies.
So this isn't just theory. This is a strategic imperative.
Absolutely. The goal here is to help you avoid that paralysis, that misallocation of resources that happens when you're staring at a list of 78 different options.
Okay, so we've taken those 78 and boiled them down to the big five. These are the ones the research shows are really dominating the conversation right now.
Right. We're talking about critical thinking, design thinking, creative thinking, systems thinking, and the newest one on the block, computational thinking.
So before we get into their kind of growth stories, let's just do a quick baseline. What are we actually talking about with each of these?
Good idea. So critical thinking, that's your foundation. It's the disciplined, evidence-based evaluation of information. It's basically asking, is this true and why?
Okay, and then creative thinking is almost the mirror image of that. It's about generating new and useful ideas, asking, what else could we do?
Exactly. Then you have design thinking, which is a very human-centered process for problem solving. It's all about empathy, trying things out, prototyping. It asks, how can we make this better for the person who's actually using it?
And systems thinking.
Yeah.
That's the big picture one. It's about understanding how all the different parts of a system connect and influence each other over time.
You're trying to answer, how does changing this one thing affect that thing 3 steps down the line?
Right, avoiding those unintended consequences.
And finally, computational thinking. This is the really modern one. It's about breaking down huge, complex problems into manageable steps so you can develop an algorithmic solution. It's asking, how can we structure this so a computer, or at least a logical process, can solve it efficiently?
Okay, that's a great foundation. So let's unpack the landscape, because their growth stories are really different.
Very different.
Critical thinking is, as you said, the bedrock. It has these deep historical roots in law, medicine, management, and it's just got the broadest, most sustained presence everywhere. It's the constant.
It is the stable anchor. And then you see these others with just dramatic movement. Design thinking, for example, it's had this explosive recent growth.
And that's not a coincidence.
Right. Not at all. It correlates almost perfectly with this huge organizational hunger for innovation and user-centered design. But it does make you ask the question.
Is it a real capability, or is it just the management fad of the month?
Precisely. And then there's computational thinking, which has had the most dramatic recent emergence,
Yeah,
but it's very concentrated.
right. It's mostly in education and computer science.
Yeah.
You don't really see it spreading out into, say, marketing or HR in the same way.
Not yet, anyway. It's powerful, but it's still kind of siloed. And then you have systems and creative thinking, which are sort of in that substantial middle ground.
Yeah.
Sustained relevance, but in specific areas.
Like systems thinking in engineering or environmental management.
Exactly. Places where those complex feedback loops are just part of the job.
So before we move on, there's a really fundamental point in the source material I want to make sure we hit. These are not just a list of skills.
No, absolutely not. That's a critical distinction. A way of thinking, as the research puts it, influences how a person sees the world, orients toward it, and acts upon it.
So we're not just talking about individual competencies.
We're talking about team capabilities and ultimately cultural orientations. You can't just send one person to a workshop and then say, great, now our organization does systems thinking. That doesn't work like that.
And this is what makes that suffix analysis section so interesting. Just looking at how these frameworks are labeled, the difference between a skill, an approach, and a method.
It sounds academic, but it has huge practical implications for how you'd actually implement them.
Okay, so take critical thinking. Overwhelmingly, it's called a skill.
Right. And what does that make you think of? Training modules, competency development, assessments, things you can measure in an individual.
But then you have systems thinking, which is usually labeled an approach. And that just feels bigger.
It is bigger. It implies a whole methodological shift. You can't learn an approach in a 2-day workshop. It affects how teams frame problems, how projects are budgeted, how you even define success. It requires real cultural adaptation.
And this is where design thinking gets tricky, because it's kind of stuck in the middle.
It's all over the place. The research shows it's split almost equally between being called a method, an approach, and a process.
And that ambiguity is actually dangerous.
It is, because if you treat it just as a method or a process, you get this risk of mechanistic application. Teams just follow the steps, empathize, ideate, prototype, without actually adopting the human-centered mindset that's supposed to underpin the whole thing.
They're doing the what without understanding the why.
Exactly. They skip the approach part.
So the takeaway for you as a leader is pretty clear. If you launch a skill initiative, you buy a training course. If you launch an approach initiative, you might need to redesign your team's weekly meetings, their decision protocols, maybe even their bonuses.
It's a much bigger commitment.
But, okay, these labels and definitions only matter if these frameworks actually drive results. So let's talk about the measurable performance impacts.
Yes, let's. Because they deliver real, tangible value. Critical thinking, for instance, consistently links to better decision quality
How so?
by reducing cognitive bias and leading to much stronger problem diagnosis. One big meta-analysis found a pretty significant effect size, about D equals 0.30 for general outcomes.
Okay, let's translate that out of academic speak for a second. An effect size like that, it's a meaningful improvement. It means your team is maybe a third more likely to correctly find the root cause of a failure or to make fewer costly mistakes.
That's pure business value right there. And then you look at creative thinking, that's your engine for novelty. The research shows that organizations that really cultivate this report 2 to 3 times higher rates of breakthrough innovation.
So not just small improvements, but the big game-changing ideas.
The ones that let you jump ahead of the competition.
What about those really messy challenges? The wicked problems with tons of stakeholders and delayed consequences.
That is the sweet spot for systems thinking. It delivers huge value there. By forcing a team to take that holistic view, you significantly reduce problem recurrence.
You stop solving the same problem over and over again.
And you minimize the negative side effects that a more linear, straightforward approach almost always misses. You solve one problem without creating 3 new ones.
But this brings up a really critical point. The danger of focusing on just one of these. Let's say a company goes all in on critical thinking. Rigorous evaluation is king. What's the downside?
The downside is you foster cynicism and analysis paralysis. If the only tool you value is the one that finds flaws, you eventually kill the ability to generate new ideas in the first place.
And I imagine that has a cultural impact.
A big one. The data shows employees in those critical-only cultures report way lower psychological safety. If you know every new idea is just going to get shredded, you simply stop offering them.
So the best outcomes happen when you match the framework to the challenge, not just chase whatever's popular, which means we had to talk about combinations.
Yes. The real advantage comes from building that balanced, complementary portfolio. And the good news is we don't have to guess at the right pairings. The research shows clear patterns of which ones work well together.
Let's start with the most common one. Critical thinking plus creative thinking. This is the classic innovation equation, isn't it?
It really is. You need that divergent creative thinking to generate a wide range of ideas, and then you need the convergent critical thinking to rigorously evaluate them and pick the winner.
And the key is managing the tension between those two modes.
It is. The pharmaceutical company Merck has a great example of this. They explicitly separate the creative, divergent phases of hypothesis generation from the critical, convergent phases of experimental design.
So you don't have the evaluators in the room when the new ideas are just being born.
Exactly. They recognize that premature criticism just suppresses novelty, so they manage the synergy by creating that separation.
That makes so much sense. Okay, what about in a complex service environment, like a hospital or a government agency?
There, the killer combination is systems thinking plus design thinking.
Why those two?
Well, systems thinking gives you that big picture, holistic view of the infrastructure, the resources, the constraints. But design thinking layers on the human-centered perspective and that iterative experimental approach. You really need both.
So one handles the macro efficiency and the other handles the micro quality.
You've got it. Think about urban planning. Singapore's Urban Redevelopment Authority is a fantastic case study. They use systems thinking for the huge citywide infrastructure, but then they use design thinking, actually going out and talking to residents to make sure the public spaces and services are truly human-centered.
That's a great example, and I'm guessing there's another key pairing now with, the explosion of data and AI.
Absolutely. The new power couple is computational thinking plus critical thinking.
So you're combining the ability to structure and process massive amounts of data with the ability to question it.
You have to. It's the only way to avoid a garbage in, garbage out scenario. You use algorithmic reasoning, but then you apply critical thinking to ask, is this data biased? Is the model valid? Does this result even make sense in the real world?
You're not just blindly trusting the output of the machine.
You can't afford to. So the goal is always balance, creative plus entrepreneurial for commercialization, futures plus strategic for long-term planning. It's never about relying on just one way of seeing the world.
Okay, these pairings are powerful in theory, but to make them work in a real organization
Right.
with real people, you need one crucial element.
You do, and this is the hardest part, the culture.
It all comes down to the infrastructure of cognitive diversity.
It does, because as we've said, critical thinking and creative thinking often lead to conflicting recommendations, and that tension is incredibly valuable.
Only if the culture sees it as an asset, not as a threat.
Exactly. And the mechanism for managing that tension is psychological safety.
Talk more about that. Why is it so crucial?
Well, without psychological safety, people just default to whatever framework seems politically safest. The one the boss likes or the one that's always been used. You lose the entire value of that cognitive tension, and you just get mediocre consensus.
So how do you build that safety?
Look at a company like IDEO. They
Hmm.
deliberately staff teams with people who have different framework expertise, and their leaders explicitly legitimize all of them. They model an openness to being challenged, so when the critical thinker and the creative thinker are arguing, it's seen as productive, not disruptive.
That culture itself becomes the innovation engine.
It's the true engine. But beyond safety, you also need proper developmental scaffolding. You can't just throw people in the deep end.
You need a strategic approach to the learning itself.
And the research is pretty clear that sequencing matters. Critical thinking is usually the foundation you want to build first. You have to ensure people have that basic logical reasoning down before you introduce really complex stuff like algorithmic thinking.
You're building on a solid foundation.
Right. There's a great example from Desmos, the edtech company. Before they introduce design thinking for curriculum development, they first cultivate the teacher's critical thinking skills, analyzing student work, evaluating research. The innovation that comes out of that is so much more grounded and sophisticated as a result.
And finally, it has to be more than a one-time thing.
Yep.
It needs infrastructure.
Yes. Capability isn't built in a workshop. It's built through ongoing reinforcement. That means expert coaching, tool libraries, and recognition systems that reward the application of the framework, not just sitting through the course.
Consulting firms like McKinsey are the classic example here. They maintain their capability through apprenticeship and these really explicit debriefing protocols where they analyze how frameworks were used on every single project.
They embed the learning directly into the workflow. That's what makes it stick.
So as we wrap up, let's distill this all down. If you're looking at your own organization, what are the key takeaways?
I think there are three. First, no single framework is enough. Not critical, not design, not any of them. The world is just too complex for one tool.
Second, selection has to be strategic. You have to align the framework to your actual challenges and capability gaps, not just chase whatever's popular in the business press this year.
And third, and this is the most important one, sustainable capability needs infrastructure. And above all, it needs psychological safety to manage that productive, valuable tension between all these different ways of thinking.
It's clear from Crilly's work that these are enduring frameworks, not just fads. I mean, you see them being applied to the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, which tells you they're essential for humanity's biggest challenges, from climate change to health.
They're fundamental tools for problem solving.
So we'll leave you with this final thought to mull over. What strategic problem in your organization right now demands a thinking framework that you haven't yet deliberately cultivated and, just as importantly, built the infrastructure to support? Start there. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.